Game 11, the final game between Magnus Carlsen and Nepomniachtchi in their World Championship match. Magnus was up by 3 points already in this match, and Nepo had to find a way to break his defense. So he tried in this final game with e4. And Magnus played e5, knight f3, knight c6, and this time Nepo goes for the Italian game with bishop c4. But it became pretty obvious pretty soon that he didn't have anything special in this line against Magnus. And he never was able to pose any serious threat to Magnus in this game. So knight f6. And now knight g5 would have led to really sharp positions after d5, ed, knight a5 check. And black has compensation in this line. This is a well-known line. So I'm pretty sure Magnus and his team, if Magnus played knight f6 so confidently that he had this prepared. So Nepo didn't even try to probe this. Instead, he played d3, which is a quieter line. But then Magnus is more than comfortable in these lines. Bishop c5, c3, d6, castles. It's also possible to play a move like b4 and go for immediate queenside play, but then it's nothing immediate for white, although it looked immediate in the moment, because after knight e7, white again has to slow play with a move like h3. So he goes for castling, and Magnus plays a5. There's many ways to play this position. You could have the pawn on a6 as well. You could castle, you could maybe play even h6. But a5 from Magnus, preventing any b4 ideas, and he's like, I have no issues with you doing whatever you want to do on h5 or g5 if you want to do that. So rook e1 was tried by Nepo, and Magnus drops his bishop back to a7, still waiting for white to show his hand and see where he's going. Also, bishop a7 is a useful move because in the event that white ever plays d4, the bishop's not immediately hit by that move, so he can react to d4 in his own way and not have to react in the moment to d4. So bishop a7. Knight a3, useful move. Knight will come to c2 and then potentially e3 and d5. And h6 from Magnus, stopping bishop g5 ideas. And knight c2 as we discussed. Castles. Bishop e3, okay, finally he trades this guy out. And now Magnus played rook e8. Could have played bishop e6, but I guess with a move like bishop takes, f takes, if white hasn't achieved an advantage, he's at least managed to create some sort of imbalance in the position. And I'm sure Magnus knows how to play these positions, but he probably didn't want to play these type of positions when the challenger is desperately wanting to create something. So he just played rook e8, preparing to play bishop e6, and then rook takes, and no double pawns. Now here, it's really hard for white to make progress. For example, if queen b3, trying to hit f7, then black can play a4. Because if bishop takes and king f8 stays with this guy, and this queen is getting out of squares to protect that bishop. So queen c4, but then knight a5. And now the queen has to move away. Queen takes a4. And bishop, or well, yeah, just king takes f7. Bishop d7 is not necessary. And now if b4 trying to win this pinned knight to the rook, then bishop d7. And the knight is unpinned because the rook is now protected. So this is not working. So he would have to play a move like queen c2. But then Magnus would probably play for grabbing this guy with bishop d7. And let's say, now he's threatening knight a5. So let's say white tries b4, then black would try b5. Bishop takes, knight takes, b4 takes, and he's lost his most powerful piece in the position. So this shows why a move like queen b3 would not have worked for Nepo. So instead he played a4, stopping any a4 ideas from black and preparing a move like queen b3, but then bishop e6 from Magnus, saying, hey, now I'm ready to take your bishop with my rook, and there's no double pawns, even though Nepo tried queen b3, but the rook is protected, so he can deal with the loose pawn on b7 with b6. When I saw this, I was a bit worried about a move like b6, because I'm like, doesn't this make this knight lose? But there's no easy way for white to exploit that, and he just plays b6, removes the weakness entirely, and this knight can always move around. So that's one way of solving your problems. So rook a to d1 and knight e7 immediately from Magnus. He deals with his loose piece. He's ready for any of white's jumps with the knight here, because he'll just take. And even previously in a position like this one, if white had tried knight d5, then black could have simply swapped it off in knight e7. And now he's threatening to take here. So a move like queen b3, but that's too clumsy, and queen c8 holds that, and white doesn't really get anything out of this. So after takes, we get this configuration, and now Nepo, at least for the moment, he stopped d5. So he plays h3, because now if d5, then takes, and rook takes e5. So Magnus plays slow with queen d7. And white is struggling to find ideas in this position. For example, he could have tried, an engine suggestion is queen to c2 here. Because if rook d8, then he could perhaps try for b4, take, and d5 and b5, and now fix this weakness here and maybe play against that in the future. Obviously, this is far from over. Black has play in this line as well. But there was one try. Nepo tried something else. He played knight to h2, and that was based on probably based on some calculation that he did, which turned out to be a wrong calculation. Because after knight g4, take, obviously Nepo had seen d5, and he probably thought that in this position he could hit Magnus with d4. Well, what's the point? Well, first of all, let's see d takes e4. Then white could potentially play d5, sacrifice a pawn, rook d6, c4, and play for this sort of a bind on the position with this pawn on d5. Black would have to break this with h5, takes, and pawn to f5. But then white can find ways to make the game complicated with queen c3, f4, c5, take, knight c4, take, lots of trades, and knight takes a5, and the game remains complex. Even though objectively black may be slightly better here, but it's far from over, and it's definitely Nepo's type of position. So you've probably seen something like this. And on e takes d4, so Magnus avoids that trap. He had intended e takes d5 as he played, because other moves are pretty useless. C takes d, just you drop the pawn, and if rook takes d4, then simply rook takes e4. There's nothing here. Takes, rook d1, but what are you getting out of this endgame? You're already a pawn down. You might win the pawn back, but that's about it, and this is a completely equal endgame. Excuse me. So he played e takes d5. His point obviously is that if knight takes, then rook takes d4, and now this knight is pinned to the queen. And he can follow it up with moves like rook e to d1, pawn to c4, and that's going to be lost. So he cannot take the knight. So black would have to play rook e4, and here he had seen queen c2 hitting this rook. And he probably missed Magnus's response here, rook f4, which now indeed threatens to take this knight. Because he, as he said after the game, he said that he saw g3, which is what he played, pawn takes knight, g takes f4, and here he said that he only saw pawn takes pawn check, which would have led to a reasonable position for him with queen takes g4 check, queen g2. Black cannot really trade because then the endgame is winning for white. So queen h4 defending this knight that's attacked by the rook. And Nepo probably saw this position and realized, okay, I have reasonable chances to play for a win here. But when this position occurred, he took a bit of time to play g3, so he must have recalculated all variations, and for him to say that he still didn't see queen g4 in this moment is it's hard to believe. And if it's true, if that's indeed what happened, and then it just shows that how much of an effect Magnus has had on Nepo, and he's completely destroyed him as a chess player just with the way he crushed him in game 6. I think that it just started a downward spiral for Nepo. But why would he go for g3? Let's assume that he saw it and he was too embarrassed to admit that he didn't want to play any other move. Well, to his point, if let's say c takes d4, then knight takes d5, takes, and what is that? Black has two weaknesses. White has two weaknesses. Black only has one weakness, and this is hardly a position you can play for a win with. If rook takes d4, then trades all throughout. Queen takes c7, queen takes d4, and again, this is a level position with b3. You cannot play for a win in this position against Magnus. So he was probably like, g3 is what I had planned. If g3 doesn't work, nothing works. My world championship dreams are over. And so I might as well go through with it and endure the suffering this way. I don't want to come tomorrow again and play for a win when I'm unable to win this game with white. So maybe that's what happened, we don't know. But he played g3, which was a horrific blunder, because it doesn't take much to realize that pawn takes knight, pawn takes rook, and queen takes g4 check, and black should at least have a draw in this position with perpetual checks. So king f1 was played, and now queen h3 check. Now if he tries to escape with king to e2, then black has pawn takes pawn, because if king takes, then check here and wins the queen. So where was I? Queen takes, check. So if he tries to escape like this, and then let's say he plays rook f1, then black has knight f5, and he's got many threats, one of which is queen e3 mate. So for example, knight d3 check, or queen d3 stops the mate, but knight g3 check takes, and now check, gets out of the knight, unpins the knight because the queen is hanging after queen takes queen. So queen check here and takes. And this may seem like an equal position materially, but rook e8, and this king is incredibly exposed, and black's already threatening queen h3 and grabbing that queen. So this is not a position that white can survive in. So that's why he cannot play king e2 and try to run. So he's got to play king g1, and now an easy win for Nepo was pawn takes pawn here, because if king takes, then check and wins the queen, as we have seen. And if queen takes, then he had rook d6 threatening rook g6 and mate, and there is no defense to that. And Magnus surprisingly did not find this line, this simple line. But I think that what probably happened to Magnus as well is that he was not expecting g3. You could tell from his reaction, like, what is that move and what is happening? So am I winning the world championship in this game? So a lot more was happening in his own head besides the chess. So he was probably disturbed by the turn of events, because all this while he was playing for an equal game, and suddenly now he's playing for the win. So it was hard for him as well, being the world champion, despite being the world champion, to adjust to what just happened. And so he played knight f5, which is not a bad move. but it's not winning. He missed something in his calculations. So obviously Magnus's plan here is to play knight h4, and then he's threatening knight f3 mate and queen g2 mate. So it's not easy to see how white can try to stop those two mates at the same time. So let's assume that white plays a move like rook to d3, planning to take on e3 and eliminate this dangerous pawn. Then knight h4, and now pawn takes pawn. And now knight f3 check, and we get the same check and wins the queen. So Nepo surprised him with pawn to d6, clearly a move that Magnus missed. Because now if he tries the same idea, which he did, knight h4, and after pawn takes pawn, he does not have knight f3 check, because king f2 check, take, and now queen takes queen, but white has d takes c7 at the end. And white is at least equal, because now this rook unfortunately cannot hide anywhere. If rook takes rook, then queens, and white is, well, I wouldn't say white is at least equal. White is fighting for equality, but he's close to being equal. And if he hides, let's say rook to f8, then rook d8, and white's threatening to queen, and there's no easy way to stop that. Queen f5, rook d1, he's threatening rook takes, rook d8, and c8, and black has to take a perpetual with queen h3. So that would be a sad turn of events. So Magnus played queen g3 first, stopping king f2, and after king f1, now he plays knight f3, threatening queen g1 and queen g2 mate. So if dc7, then check and mate like that. So Nepo has to stop that, so he plays queen f2. And now it would be horrific if Magnus played queen takes queen, take and take, because again dc7 creates the same problem. Rook takes, then queens, or if rook moves elsewhere, then rook d8, or you can just be extremely sadistic and take the knight and say you still cannot stop this pawn from queening. But Magnus is too good for that. Queen h3 check. And now if king e2, then black could take on e1. And then if, let's say, he tries to take here, then queen g4 check. And if king takes, then of course this is mate. And if king f1, then he can still take on d1, because now the queen's watching the c8 square. Still, I think that there was a chance for Nepo here takes, and he could have tried king takes e1, because now the engines think black's best choice is to play rook takes pawn, and then after takes takes, we have a queen endgame, which Magnus will probably still drag into a win, but it's far from over, I think, because I think that white's chances to hold this queen endgame are reasonable, although this h-pawn is going to be a menace pretty soon. So maybe Nepo assessed that this is not really holdable for white against Magnus. So instead he went for queen g2, which allows a queen trade this way. And after takes, rook takes, and Magnus is up a clear pawn on the h file, and it's a passed pawn. And now he allows Magnus to show some incredible endgame technique. I was a bit surprised that he didn't play rook e2 here, because that at least cuts out the rook from the 7th rank, and black would probably play rook d1 and try this way, but he allowed him to play rook d2, and after rook b1, g6, and he's going for h5. g6 is a flexible move because it makes room for the king as well, makes f5 possible in some lines, and while f5 is defended. So that was pretty interesting, and also asking the question of Nepo, what are you doing? So b4 is Nepo's response, and Magnus takes. And now if if he takes here, then Magnus can simply go here, and if rook c1 just takes, and he's up 2 pawns, and that's an easy win. So he takes with the rook, and then rook a2, incredible control from this rook. He's not allowing the white rook to be free to do any activity, because now if rook c4, then he completely cuts him out with c5. So Nepo tried king e4, And Magnus now starts to roll his pawn ahead with h5. King d5, and now he played what I thought was a really impressive move with rook to c2, because he could have just played h4, but things get a little messy here with f5. And if black's not careful, black can get into trouble, because if, let's say, g5 to defend this pawn, you don't want to take on f5 because that ruins your pawn structure, opens up your king as well, and plus it's dropping h4. So g5, but then rook g4. Now you got to protect this guy, but so f6. King e6 hits that guy, king g7, and now rook d4, and suddenly it's white who is entering into black's kingdom, and this pawn's gonna fall. That pawn's probably gonna fall, and white might be in danger of getting mated here, because black might be in danger of getting mated because white has a pawn here too, which will act as a shield for this king, and this rook will come down here and start creating lots of problems. So that was a danger in the position. So Magnus first played rook c2, saying, how are you going to deal with this guy? Because of course now if black goes king c6, going for this pawn, he just laughs with rook takes c3 and defends c7 indirectly, or through the king, as it were. And if rook c4, then this rook has no easy path to stop this pawn after h4, because he wants to get on the first rank to stop him, but this pawn is his way. So he has to play rook b3, and now that makes any rook takes h4 ideas impossible, and now Magnus goes h4. So a little precision there, but it was beautiful to watch his skill. And now white has to try king c6, so he does h3, takes h2, and now he stops with the h pawn with rook b1. And now the engines here are going crazy with moves like rook b2, for example, because if you take, obviously, then you queen, right? But rook h1, and then a sample line goes f6. Now he's threatening to push this pawn, so let's go through it. c4, g5, take, c5, and white's created a pass pawn. And now white's in time to play rook a1, get behind the pawn, and push this guy. And now black has many defenses, one of which is rook a2, takes and queens, a7, queen a8, and stops the pawn, amazingly. Another defense is to play rook to f2 and say, you're not queening that one, because if a7 check and I take it that way, and after it takes I queen. And a third defense is to play g2, saying you can queen with check, but king g7, and I still win. But obviously no human player would want to go into that position. But I think what Magnus did was far simpler. h2, rook b1, and he took here with check, because if takes, which is what Nepo did, he had to try it. Rook b3 check forces the trade of rooks, and now h1 queen. Yes, he's got a pass pawn here, but that's not going to be enough. It's not moving quickly. a5, queen e4, now it threatens check and takes the rook. So king a7 stops that idea. Queen e7 check, king here. Because if rook b7, then queen c5 check, and now he has to defend this to king a6, and now he can't even move this guy. And black just picks up another pawn. So queen to e7, king goes to a8, now king g7. Another instructive moment. If queen d8 check, trying to win this guy, then rook b8, suddenly he's pinned his own queen to the king and he loses the game. So you always got to be attentive in these endgames. King g7 sidesteps that trap, and now it's over. Rook b6 and queen c5, beautiful move, completely paralyzing white, and Nepo resigns. Because let's say rook a6 defending this pawn, now this pawn's not moving, so queen, you could take this pawn for starters, but look at this beautiful move, queen b5, saying, where are you going? I'm going to zugzwang you. Rook a7, let's say, king f6, e4 here, e5, king d5, no problem. Where are you going? Because if you take on f7, then queen e8 check, I pick up the rook. But if you don't do that, if you play something else like a6, I just go back and zugzwang. You have to move. You play, like, let's say rook b7, then I take the pawn and I win. So that was quite a beautiful finish from Magnus, and it's amazing that he won 4 games in this World Championship match after having had so many draws in the previous World Championship matches. So this was quite an entertaining match, but it all began with Game 6, where he simply destroyed Nepo psychologically, I think, and it was a bit surprising to see Nepo say that he didn't know what went wrong. Maybe he did, but he was too embarrassed to admit it. But to everyone else, it was pretty clear what happened there, and it'll be interesting to see who the next challenger for Magnus will be. I think Firuz Shah Ali Reza is a hot candidate to challenge him. So that will be some match to see. I think Firuza is still not at Magnus's level, but he's up there. He's getting really really good. So, and he's full of energy. So it'll be interesting to see that match and how that goes, and if Magnus can beat him off as well and win another world crown. But until then, I'll be happy to bring you other videos of Magnus and other grandmasters and explain why they made the moves that they made. So I hope you have enjoyed this Wes Explains Why series on the World Championship, and I look forward to doing more of these Wes Explains Why videos where I explore the rationale behind the moves as I understand it with my analysis of the play of the grandmasters. So looking forward to that, and I hope you have enjoyed this series on the World Championship.